This is How to Reach the West Again, a podcast that aims to inspire and empower a fresh missionary encounter with Western culture. I'm your host, Brandon O'Brien. For all of Season 2, we're focused on cities. What are they? What does the Bible say about them? How do we plant churches there? What does it mean to love and serve our cities? My guests today are Robert Elkin and Chris Hernandez. Chris and Robert have lots of ministry experience between them. Robert has planted 2 churches. Chris is a lead pastor of Hope Astoria in Queens and served in ministry for years before that in Brooklyn. In addition to their roles in local churches, Robert and Chris coach and train church planters and pastors throughout New York City. They have great perspective on the unique challenges of city ministry in general and how those challenges have been compounded by the COVID-19 pandemic. There's some subtle and helpful insights in today's conversations for agencies, denominations, and movement leaders who support pastors and church planters in cities. One more note, both Robert and Chris make reference to a program called Incubator. That's a 2-year cohort-based training experience for folks who have just planted or are just about to plant a church in New York City. Stay tuned to the end for more information if you're interested. Without further ado, here's our conversation. The whole focus of this season is the city. We've talked to people about understanding what it means to kind of love and serve the city. We've talked to people about understanding what the city is even and the kind of dynamics of how to engage it and how it changes. We've talked about the kind of theology of the city. And I'm excited to talk to you guys because the where the rubber hits the road with all of this is what is it like to actually serve through a local church in actual ministry in a neighborhood in New York City. And you guys represent both practitioners who have planted churches, served in churches, etc., but also coaches, trainers who work with other practitioners who are doing that kind of work here. And so I'm excited to talk to you about your own experience and to help us understand better what some of the challenges are that are unique to serving in ministry in a complex place like New York City. So to kind of get us started, I think it'd be helpful, especially for people who are listening outside of New York, to get a little bit of context. Robert, you moved to the city in 2005 into Brooklyn. Chris, you grew up in Brooklyn and are now pastoring in Astoria in Queens. And so can you maybe, Robert first, Chris, give us a little bit of context, like paint us a picture of Brooklyn right now, the ministry context kind of the part of the city that you're living in. What do we need to know about Brooklyn to understand what ministry is like there?
Yeah, so I think Brooklyn's changed significantly since I moved here 17 years ago, and the Brooklyn that Chris grew up in, and then my wife grew up in, and they actually grew up like very close to each other, oddly, in Brooklyn. But parts of it have changed significantly, and a lot of that is because of gentrification. And now, one big shift I think is that so many people who work and play in Manhattan now live in Brooklyn, and that was much less the case 20 years ago. And that's a big shift. Part of that was very much underway before the pandemic, and part of it was fast forwarded in the pandemic, where especially with young families, I was just in a conversation on Saturday with a bunch of friends from Brooklyn, from our neighborhood, not Christians, not churchgoers, whatever, but they were saying like, yeah, all their friends from Manhattan have moved to Brooklyn, literally every single one. And they've just kind of picked up their community and moved to Brooklyn. And so that's, caused an increase in housing costs. It's changed the landscape of Brooklyn a good bit. But like I said, a lot of that was underway, even going back more than 20 years. I mean, Park Slope in Brooklyn has been like a suburb for Manhattan for probably 30 years now. So that's the context of Brooklyn. So transiency is still as much of an issue as ever and deeply, deeply impacts any ministry efforts. Whether you're trying to do citywide efforts or more like localized, either way, you're going to be dealing with stuff like transiency, cost of living, those kinds of things in Brooklyn.
Yeah. Great. Thanks. Yeah. Chris, tell us a little about Astoria.
Yeah. Well, Astoria is a really fascinating neighborhood in that it has really strong ethnic ties to the Greek community, one of the largest Greek communities in New York City. But because of its proximity to Midtown, you could be in Midtown in no time from Astoria, when probably over like 15 years ago, when development plans in the city began to get approved. At that time in Long Island City, which is a neighborhood right next to Astoria, had like one skyrise, and it was the Citigroup building. Now Queens has a skyline. It's insane. And so now that neighborhood has been just inundated with young professionals, folks that are looking to be kind of a similar situation to Brooklyn, as Robert explained. Like they want to have proximity to the city, but they don't want to live in the city. And so they want to be in a neighborhood that's in the boroughs and get kind of both hand. And so, but at the same token, it's home to some of the largest housing developments in the country. And so, famous for the housing projects where Nas, the rapper, grew up and did some of his iconic albums with the New York skyline in the background. And it's, the neighborhoods around kind of this, very expensive area, Long Island City, Astoria now, still exist, like Ravenswood housing projects, and in a lot of poverty and a lot of crime and a lot of difficult situations. And so it's, you feel those tensions, and that you can go and get, $20 avocado toast, and then a few blocks over, you could get robbed, and so it's a different, it's an interesting experience, to say the least.
So there's a lot of change over time that you're describing, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years. A lot of that change is accelerated, Robert, like you mentioned, by the pandemic. I get the sense in a lot of conversations that I have with people outside of New York in the U.S. that the pandemic is kind of like a past. It doesn't really affect ministry anymore. Maybe we have fewer people, or the makeup of the congregation has changed, but we're kind of back on course. But the more I talk to people in New York and talk to people in cities outside the U.S. that are dense and complex like New York, there's a lot of anxiety still about the way the pandemic has changed the realities of ministry. So maybe in addition to kind of like the big shifts that have happened over time, what are you guys seeing now as the kind of permanent or semi-permanent, or right now at the very least, COVID has changed? Is this late COVID, late state? What are we in? I don't know anymore, but it's not the beginning. It's kind of sort of not in the public consciousness quite as much, but how has that changed the realities of what ministry looks like on the ground in an average New York City church?
I was in a conversation with a pastor last week who told me who recently did a survey of his congregation, a decent sized congregation too, not like a survey of 20 people. It was like several hundred people. And half of his church has been in New York more than 10 years. 47% of his church has been here less than 2 years. And then there's 8% left. So that's one thing, that's one big shift of New York is everybody here has been here since the pandemic or more than 10 years.
Interesting.
Basically everyone.
Yeah.
So that's a massive thing. Like, how do you build community? How do you do discipleship that can last? I think the other ones that are more citywide, that are also citywide, but that churches are dealing with, is just like mental health.
Yeah.
Is such an issue in New York because the pandemic just ravaged us. It ravaged our communities, everything about our lives, took everything away. Like mental health, such a thing. And then that bleeds out in other things like homelessness and crime and stuff going on the subways. And all of those things are real and real time. They're happening all the time. And I think people, I know people personally who are getting chased on subway cars with a person with a wrench last week. Or, like, it's still real time, the stuff that's happening in the city that in a lot of ways is a part of the process of the pandemic continuing to unfold in our city. Those are a couple of like very specific kinds of examples, but.
Well, and for context, I think a lot of people, at least in the United States, have a perception that kind of behavior, somebody chasing you with the wrench on a subway, is kind of normal. That's what happens in New York. But I think 5 years ago, if you were in New York, something like that would make the news is like a really this doesn't happen here anymore, right? That maybe in the kind of public consciousness outside the city that it's unsafe or that it's whatever, but what you're describing is not like par for the course. It's something that's a more recent
the subways are very different now
Yes.
than they were the first 15 years I lived here. Very, very different.
Yeah, interesting.
So the subways is one, but the subways, I mean, there's nothing more New York than the subways.
Yeah.
Like it is, New York cannot exist without the subways.
Yes.
Yeah.
And more people don't feel safe riding them.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that's more like a way that the city's changed, how that's impacting ministry. We could get into some of that, but I'd love to hear Chris' thoughts on.
No, I think, what was striking to me was, I think it was in 2021, the summer of 2021, I happened to be in Atlanta for a couple days. And I realized, I think it might have been Ed Stetzer that said about certain states, his phrase has rung true. It's like they didn't fully participate in the pandemic. And so when I was in Atlanta, I was like, I don't think they fully participated here. And but what I realized is they lived socially distant, whereas here we didn't have that option. And so to Robert's point about the psychological impact that COVID had, like I know of a funeral parlor in East New York. A busy month in this funeral parlor pre-pandemic was 10 people. And this was an insanely busy month. During the pandemic, he had 60 a week.
Gosh.
And that's just one funeral parlor. So everyone that was here, the ambulances and constant for months. And so, that has an impact that people are still unraveling from. And then, so with respect to ministry, we're seeing folks that are not coming back to the gathered space with the church. One, because this has just totally shifted their rhythms, their priorities, their emotional health. They don't feel safe, or they just feel very disconnected and isolated socially. So it's like, if it was a struggle to get up on a Sunday after a long week and commute to a church and they faithfully push through back in the day, now there's such a drastic reset that, so we're seeing a lot of churches, these are kind of anecdotal things we're sharing, but what we see at churches, so many of them, their congregations have been slashed in terms of the membership, anywhere up to half, at least 25%, budgets, and then you have people that were faithfully committed and part of your church before the pandemic have moved. There's been a mass exodus of people, leaving the city or leaving where they were at because the work from home thing was such a, at least for me, such a surprise uppercut in this whole thing. I was expecting the economy, that's what's going to really be ruined, and how many people are going to die, that's what's going to change everything. But what's changed the landscape of New York just as significantly is now people could take their New York salary and go live in Pennsylvania. And if you don't feel called to the city, really rooted, it's going to be a hard, argument to win and say, no, you should stay here and suffer for the sake of reaching the city when you could get a backyard, somewhere that's bigger than 6 apartments, you know, and so just a backyard. So it's, a lot has changed.
Yeah. It's interesting, the way what you're describing. We had, in an earlier episode, Tom Dyja on the show. He wrote a book called New York, New York, New York, which is a history of the city for the last 40 years. And his metaphor for how the city works is that it's kind of like a brain that has these different parts that are all connected by synapses or pathways. And so it's like each one is a different social network that are different parts of the city, and they interact through all these different connections. And when you talk about ridership is down on the subway, that's like a broken connection, right? So people that are coming from one borough and to another for work, that's gone. Or you're coming down for Central Park, or you're doing whatever from various parts of the city. When you're working from home, that's a connection that breaks. When you're meeting for church online instead of in person, that's a connection that sort of breaks. When I talked with Tom, he was recovering from COVID and said that, kind of comparing the fog of your brain to the sort of fog in the city of like, it just kind of slows it down. But you kind of have to build those connections back up. And that's a tough reboot after something like this. And so I mentioned that to say that part of the work that you do with City to City is trying to like explicitly make these kinds of connections between pastors and networks and denominations and things. How has that work of like connecting pastors with each other been affected by not just the pandemic, but the fact that a lot of people move out and a lot of new people come in? And over the last couple of years, in addition to pandemic, there's been all kinds of social movements and activism and things that have really created, I don't know if they created division, but they highlighted division between people. How was the work of that kind of citywide network building affected by the events of the last couple of years?
Man, I would say it's both slow and incredibly hopeful in the sense that, gathering of any sorts these days is just like, it's an uphill battle. People are just tired, they're reticent. And so like even worthy things, it's like, I've never felt like the pressure or the need to convince people, so to speak, of like, no, you want to be here. This is not going to be a waste of your time. You should come, because people are just tired or spent. And so it's just slow because everything else is just so heavy in people's lives. Things that used to be a bit more simpler are just more taxing. At the same token, it's incredibly hopeful because what we get to have is kind of a front row seat and see a lot of stuff that's happening throughout the city. And it's amazing, despite the challenges and really the trauma that the city's been through. There's networks that are burgeoning during this time. Pastors are rooting for each other and encouraging each other and wanting to see each other succeed, because I think if anything, the pandemic showed that, we will, whether we want to face it or not, we will all rise or fall, together, whether we want to or not, on some levels. And so, I think one of the hopeful part is that where if churches before the pandemic or church plants before the pandemic were Sunday-centric and only, the pandemic definitely shut that down. Mm-hmm. And so churches that are on the other side of the pandemic and are somewhat thriving despite the challenges is because during the pandemic, they learned some skill sets of being engaged in the community. And so now coming out of it, some churches are enjoying the experience of more people knowing about them in the community than actually attend their church on Sunday, because now they're seen as a valuable neighbor in the community. And so, I can keep you here for a while with incredible stories that have given me a lot of hope despite how difficult the season is. Like, no, the gospel's still moving forward. The Holy Spirit's still at work. Slow and hopeful. That's how I would put it.
Yeah. Robert, do you have anything to add to that?
I think you said that well. I think I agree, the slow and hopeful thing. It's pastors coming out of this who see the need for more of a collective effort have a much better shot of healthy missional fruitfulness. And I think we're seeing that there are a lot of pastors that I'm starting to get together, not just me and them, but me and one leader, but me and several leaders. And you see them coming alive in that moment. So if you can get people together, the stuff that happens when you do is really beautiful. And I think that's been a shift for us. For me, I used to spend so much time with individual church planters. And now I try to spend as much time with a small group of church planters as I can. Get them sharing what they've experienced together, what they're learning together, what their pain points are together. And that does kind of fast forward the fruitfulness of ministry, I think.
I want to make a little turn here from pandemic, although I know that's a major reality or condition. But you mentioned hopeful and slow, and it made me think about church planting in New York City without a pandemic. It's probably a pretty good description of the sort of metrics or what's different, about planning, pastoring in the city. But how do you think of success in ministry in a place like this?
Go ahead, Robert. you did your PhD work in success.
Oh, my goodness. Staying married, if you're married. That used to be the question that planters had that no one wanted to talk about. And now it's the question that planters have that they all want to talk about. I know you said pandemic aside.
Yeah.
But I think it was just really clear, get 75 people in a room on Sunday, try to get enough of them, as many of them as you can serving and as many of them as you can giving, and you might have a chance. That was the metric for a while. And we all kind of knew there's something messed up about this. There's something broken about this. We're not sure what to do. We're going to be aware of it, and we're going to see what happens. And I think that more and more planters are saying, are measuring fruitfulness by the depth of discipleship, the commitment to evangelism, and the real impact in a community. And I think that, and some of that's combined, obviously.
Sure.
But I think I just don't hear planters really thinking and talking much about how many people are coming on Sundays. They really want to know people are being drawn to Jesus. Non-Christians are interacting with Jesus, that Christians are growing in their faith and relationship with Jesus and their own following of Jesus, and that they're making some kind of difference in a community. I used to say this 5-6 years ago when I first started training, what would it look like if you started a church that if it disappeared, the neighborhood would say, wait, where'd the church go?
Yeah.
And I feel like for a lot of planters, it just went over their head. And now everybody's like, yeah, of course, that's what we're here for, and so that's a big shift. And I don't know where the end is of that, because it's really hard to say, well, okay, how committed we are to evangelism and depth of discipleship and impact in a community. Those are long game things.
Yeah.
They were for Jesus. They were long game things for Jesus, so they have to be long game things for us. And so, but I see that shift happening, and I think it's really good. And we got to keep chasing it, and we got to keep waiting on Jesus and see how it takes shape.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, Robert started by talking about am I still married? As a metric for success, and
it's really true.
I think it's everything he just said about ministry, plus how healthy is my marriage? Are my kids thriving? Is my own emotional health well? And in a city like New York, there's such a competitive dog-eat-dog vibe all over you that very easily, you can get that in your head and in your heart when it comes to ministry. And so before the pandemic, there was certainly a lot of focus on the metrics of Sunday gatherings and how big is your church and your budget and all this other stuff. And but now there's definitely a more softness and openness to say we've seen so many examples on very popular podcasts these days and documentaries, et cetera, of things that grew fast and grew big, but were so unhealthy. And so just the wake-up call of if we keep chasing those things and avoid, what Robert said, is there a depth of discipleship? Is there evangelistic fervor and focus? Does the community know we're there? What he shared, if we did shut down, would they miss us? And at the center of that, is the leader actually growing in their love and their submission to Jesus in the process? Because I'm sure you've met leaders, as I have, where they had all the trappings of success that everyone would measure, but in their honest moments, their walk with God was very, very broken and not active and vibrant, and their family life was something that they wouldn't want anybody to emulate. And so I think the scorecard of success is definitely shifting in a better direction, and I hope we can keep it there.
Yeah. So you have kind of together identified that one shift for pastors is more openness to kind of seek community networking with other pastors in the city to kind of figure out how do we do this, right? And then another one is to rethink metrics to say maybe it's not all about the numbers, it's about mental health and spiritual health and the health of our families and all those kinds of things. What do you think that means if those shifts are happening for pastors? What does that mean for coaches, trainers, people who support pastors in the work that they do? What kinds of things need to shift in order to support that shift in focus or need from the pastors?
I had some thoughts.
Yeah, jump in, man.
I thought you might.
Well, no, I think because we've experienced this where when we're talking with planters and on the ground, and we're sharing with them like, hey, you can't just plant a Sunday gathering. You have to be engaged in the community. You have to have an evangelistic focus and pathways, for folks to come to Christ. Otherwise, you're just gonna keep retreading Christians, And when they buy in and they say yes, 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 then on the side I say, man, I wish my denomination actually was on the same page. I wish they actually, because they're putting kind of external pressure on hey, that sounds all great. We agree with that theologically, but we're funding you. Where are your results? Where's your core team? Where's your Sunday gathering? And so it feels like there's still some vestiges of some of the old metrics still in the structure of things. And so I think that if somehow, because on the ground, when folks see it and they're convinced and they want to live into that, sometimes they don't always have the external support. And so I think that's still an area where folks that are not on the ground practitioners and kind of seeing the city in that way, we can somehow accelerate their view of it and get them to understand you have to have the long view. And the long view is going to require a different pace, a different set of metrics, and this isn't going to happen overnight, despite how much you may want, a church of a certain size in 3 to 5 years. If we put that aside and actually see it for the long haul and really put the right priorities at the center, then church planters might feel less of the external pressure to produce something at a rapid pace that won't end up being healthy in the long run.
Yeah, I think that depending on what stage a church planter is at, if they're at the early stage, they probably still, if they're very early, they still think they can get 150 people on a Sunday, especially if they've got some Bible training and some preaching experience and they were an A+ preacher somewhere else, whatever. And so part of training and coaching involves knowing when to kind of say, hey, you're experiencing this, that's because of this, or trying to push them into saying, hey, you can't just come and start preaching and thousands of people are going to come here. You got to just get to know the guy at the bodega behind the counter. You got to do missionary practices, not get a Sunday gathering going practices. And so there's disorientation and that training has to walk with leaders on for that, because they don't know when they show up, hey, all these metrics I have, I'm going to chuck all these, I'm going to come up with all these new ones. They're in process.
Right.
So training is you're staying in process with them and allowing them to grow in the way that God wants them to grow and walking with them in that process. And then when they grow in a certain way and they say, oh, I'm going to make this shift in my time and my effort and my whatever, or I'm going to push resources this direction, and then they find out that they're going to get pushback from a denomination from somewhere else, then you stay in that with them too.
Right.
And so part of it is just knowing that they're all on a journey and just being willing to try to push. And the thing is, we don't always know what their journey needs to hold.
Right.
So I think it's sounding we know what they're going to learn. We don't often, so we have to walk with them and really be agile with them, because there just isn't, they have to be agile, but denominations generally aren't very agile.
Right.
Like they know what they think needs to happen, and some of that pressure is good. Some of that's not all bad, right? But being agile with leaders is a really important part of training and coaching, and making sure they know they're not alone and they're not crazy. Because that's like, I think one of the number one feelings church planners still have in 2022 is, am I the only one experiencing this? I must be crazy.
Right.
And so that's the beauty of the trans-denominational training space is, you're finding out you're not the only one who's doing this and that you're not crazy.
Yeah.
It's funny you say a church planter that we work with, young church planters. They're just recently launched, and so they had their first Easter Sunday gathering, and it was amazing, of course. But they did their first go around, and so they didn't know what other planters and seasoned leaders know, that the very next Sunday is very depressing, and so it was interesting catching up with them, and they were actually very disoriented. Like, what have we built? What's happening? Because nobody showed up, and the relief that came was like, oh, that's actually very normal. It was like, for real, and so just to Robert's point, like when folks don't feel isolated, when they don't feel like they're the only one, and they get that sense of like, oh, okay, I'm not going through something unique or extra. This is par for the course. When they experience that in community, it can be really, really encouraging.
A lot of what you're describing, there's a subtext I'm picking up, is that people bring in with them expectations of what ministry might look like somewhere else and hope that replicates, or just assume that it replicates when they do similar kinds of things in the city. What kinds of things do people assume when they move to the city, feel like they have a call to, the kind of general call to follow a flow of people into the city and plant churches and try to help the gospel grow at the rate of the city growth? What kinds of things do people come in to the city with, expectations, hopes, etc., that you would like to maybe alert them of early on? They may or may not be accurate or helpful.
I mean, there are a bunch of like tactical things that they don't know, but I think that the biggest theological, frankly, like sin that they bring with them is the idea that God's showing up when they show up.
Yes.
Number one. And I did it in 2005, even though my wife was from here and my wife's dad had been a pastor for a long time. In my neighborhood, I thought God was showing up in my neighborhood when I showed up. And it is just, it is wrong and it's harmful. And I think that's a really big one, that when people show up, and it's because you got to kind of sell that. Like, look at the dark city, where Satan rules, and but we're gonna go and save it. A little part of it. Yeah. God's here long before any of us showed up. He's here now, without me, and he's gonna be here long after I leave. And so that's like number one. And we could get into lots of tactical stuff. Yeah. But I think that that one, if that one isn't kind of repented of, then it's going to be really, it doesn't really matter what else you do. It's going to be, there's going to be something always there that's unhealthy. Yeah. Always. So we could also get into the tactical stuff, but that's a big one.
Yeah.
That's great.
I mean, I would add, I think one of the things that, as a native of New York, I grew up here, came to Christ when I was 14. And so I've seen, I'm 42 now, seen church ministry for a lot of years, and the phenomenon of from 2001, post 9/11 till now, influx of church planters from different parts of the country, different parts of the world, kind of coming in to plant their flag. And, at first being hopeful, sometimes suspicious, what's going on, and then seeing so many of them not make it past a couple years, at most year 7, to the point where, for me, Robert, he's past the threshold. He's here 15 years. But before he passed 7 years, I was suspicious. Am I going to see him, forever? Because it's just the trend was so high. Good, really solid leaders, one by one, different things would normally pick them off. And one of the things that I feel if church planters could shift in the sense that if you don't learn to love the city and to live in the city as a New Yorker first, then it's going to be really hard to try to plant in the city. And because one, New Yorkers will sniff that out. They'll know, like, you're not going to be here forever. So why am I going to journey with you, invest, and go all in? But two, if you don't figure that living here and loving here apart from ministry, then you're always going to have this exit strategy potentially in the back of your, and it's that ripcord that at a certain moment when the pressure gets tough, you will exit, you will leave. And, and sometimes it's God for that to happen, better that happen than your family fall apart or stuff. But other times it's honestly just a lot of, they came in wrong. As some people say, some things don't go wrong, they start wrong. They come in wrong from the sense of they parachuted in, and there was this pressure to plant and get a viable, sustainable church within a couple weeks, months most, and they haven't figured out, how are my kids going to thrive here? Where's the doctor for me to take my kids if something happens, or like our life together as a married couple? Just the practical things that if you don't figure out how to live here, it's going to be very hard for you to be here for the long haul.
Mm-hmm. If the 2022 you could go back and have a cup of coffee with the 2005 you or the early in ministry you, Chris, what would you want to tell that person who's just starting out about the journey they're setting out on?
Are you getting emotional thinking about it? I've actually thought about this, and usually when I do, I get emotional because I'm just like, I just want to say you just have no idea what you're about to go through.
Wow.
But there's no way I could have handled that.
Yeah.
So I think that I would just give myself as much gospel as humanly possible, as much as I would take in and could absorb 2005 me. And I knew the gospel. I had read Tim Keller and all the stuff, but I would, the best that I could, try to figure out ways to get the gospel like through whatever mechanisms I have for trying to like dodge it with my own ego or my own giftedness or my own plans or my own whatever, my own ADD. But I would try to figure out ways to like get it to penetrate, which I know, the Holy Spirit has to do that. And I think part of that would just, I would love to tell myself like, God's going to hold on to you. Because I couldn't say, you have no idea what you're going to go through. But I could say, just God's going to hold on to you. And that's has been the one thing that has been true the whole 17 years I've been here. Like, God's held on to me. I don't have any other explanation. So I think gospel truth, honestly, not tactical. I mean, yeah, I can think of a million tactical things. I mean, I usually start incubator saying like, I made more mistakes than anyone. That's why I'm here, So, but beyond that, I think the gospel thing is like it kept me here.
Wow. Yeah. I really respect Robert. So when I hear him like summarize his journey in those words, they're powerful because I think I would hopefully say the same thing. Like, God's going to carry you. You're going to go through things that you never could imagine. But yeah, I hope I could tell myself, that earlier version of myself, to prioritize intimacy with Jesus above anything else that along the journey I'm going to be told I should prioritize and should make important. Because like when all else fails, like, especially even in the last 2 years, seeing churches thrive to now like they're barely getting by, and these are good, solid churches, and just people that you knew that you thought you were going to journey with forever, now they're gone. But what does remain at the end of the day, is ministry being a tool to help you grow closer to Jesus. So I hope I would, if I could tell myself that, and also like my family matters more than ministry will ever tell me. Church culture can be really crazy sometimes. You'll get a raise, you'll get promotions, you'll get celebrated while your family is going down the drain. And so just prioritize those things: intimacy with Jesus and your family, and trust God with the rest.
That's great. If somebody's moving into a city, whether it's New York City or someplace else, with a sense that God's calling them there to plant a church, to be on mission in a neighborhood, etc., how would you advise them to figure out the places that God is already at work? And not just that he's there in a theological sense, but that he's also there practically in the ministries that are already happening, et cetera. Like where would you say just begin here and then keep looking, but start here? What's first? How do they figure out what's already going on?
I'm curious. It's an interesting question because I think it's hard for planters to come with that question on their mind. So I'm not trying to I think that's actually a hard question to get them to. I think about the sending out of the 72, if you find anybody that welcomes you, just park there, And I think what Jesus is saying is that we have to be the people who don't create kind of the kingdom sweet spot, but we're the people who discover the kingdom sweet spot. And so I think most planters show up like thinking they have to create it.
Yeah.
And so I think if more planters did show up saying, okay, where's God at work?
Yeah.
That alone would be such a huge win. But I think generally it's like, go where the long timers are, walk and pray, be aware of where the marginalized people and people groups are. There's like certain things that you can do. Go sit at a pub or a coffee shop and just start telling people that you're thinking of starting a new faith community and see how people respond. Like there's like all sorts of things that you can do to start finding out what's happening. Like where are the nonprofits already at work? Like who are the church? What's the church that's been here for 50 years and has just been plugging away, like serving, like giving out groceries every Wednesday, and there's a line around the block every Wednesday. Like, where is that? There's a lot of different things that you can do, but you got to walk around and you've got to talk to people, and ask questions. Ask a lot of questions. So that's a lot of random advice.
Yeah. No, one of the things that Robert is in our different incubator spaces, he's challenged planters to just do the simple act of finding the crossing guard in your neighborhood and park right next to them and talk and ask them to give you kind of a guided tour of the neighborhood. But what Robert said in terms of finding the marginalized and seeing where ministry is happening in those spaces, I think that would be really informative for a church planter, because what they would see is not what is typically celebrated in ministry, or the idols that we're told to pursue in ministry of big budgets, big crowds, but you're going to see real ministry in those spaces. And then another helpful thing is, it's kind of an imaginative exercise, but if you imagine that Jesus came and started walking in your city, if you're coming new to a city, imagine where would he walk, and if you followed him, where would that take you? And it might take you to the pubs. It might take you to, some really difficult spaces. And it might take you also to some really posh places, but also revealing like the lack of wholeness in some of those spaces that people envy and want to, obtain, yet it's empty and it lacks what they're pursuing. And so, if planters could walk their neighborhoods and be in those marginalized spaces and figure out, if Jesus was here walking and I was following him, where would he go? That would really be transformative.
Yeah. Thanks so much, guys. This has been a pleasure to be with you. I wish we had another hour because I enjoy this very much. But thanks so much for your
Likewise.
time.
Thank you, Brandon.
Yeah.
Appreciate you.
If you serve in ministry in New York City and want to know more about the training programs and opportunities City to City offers, you can learn more online at citytocity.nyc. We have a special episode next week. Our next episode was recorded on location in Frankfurt, Germany by a group of gentlemen who represent different agencies and denominations and who work together for a gospel movement in Frankfurt. They share their story and some principles they've learned about collaboration. How to Reach the West Again is a production of Redeemer City to City. Today's episode was recorded at Gotham Production Studios in New York City. It was produced, written, and hosted by Brandon O'Brien. Our associate producer is Braden Gregg. Redeemer City to City is a nonprofit organization co-founded by Tim Keller and supported by generous people like you. If you've enjoyed this episode and would like to hear more, subscribe to the podcast on your favorite platform, leave a review, and consider making a gift to support the work at redeemercitytocity.com/give.